Daniel Miller was the kind of man people often overlooked, not because he lacked presence, but because his life was quietly dignified. In the bustling city of Chicago, where ambition and status echoed down every street, Daniel remained grounded. A modest accountant in a mid-sized firm, he lived by principles, not profits. His shoes were polished, not expensive. His words were few, but always sincere. And when he smiled at his wife, Melissa, the world faded into a beautiful blur, at least for him. Melissa was once swept up in Daniel's warmth. She had loved him for his loyalty, for the way he looked at her as though she was all the treasure this world held. For a while, that had been enough. But as years passed, and Chicago's skyline grew taller and brighter, so did her hunger for more. Luxury. Status. Prestige. She watched other women carry designer bags, step out of black cars, and sip champagne in rooftop lounges, and she wondered what it would feel like to live that life. Daniel didn't notice her restlessness at first. He was busy working late nights, saving every penny, dreaming of taking her to Paris one day. He thought love was enough. He thought that his quiet devotion would shield their world from any cracks. He was wrong. The first time she met Sean Walker was at a charity gala she attended with a friend. Daniel had to work late. Sean didn't look like the kind of man who had ever heard the word no. Tall, magnetic, dressed in a custom navy blue suit, his smile was loaded with secrets and promises. He spotted Melissa across the room, raised his glass, and walked toward her as though she was already his. She should have walked away. But she didn't. It started with harmless conversation, or so she told herself. Then came gifts, sleek watches, rare perfume, a pair of Louboutin heels. Daniel noticed, but Melissa lied, said they were knockoffs or hand-me-downs. She had become a master of deflection, a prisoner of her own rising desire. Then came the night she didn't come home. Daniel sat at their modest dinner table, candles lit, her favorite pasta cold on the plate. Midnight passed. She arrived at 2 a.m., lipstick smudged, eyes shining, not with guilt, but with fire. The confrontation was quiet. Daniel asked. She denied. He begged. She dismissed. And then, with a cruel twist of her lips, she told him the truth. I don't want this life anymore, Daniel. I don't want you. She packed her bags the next morning. Walked out with barely a glance behind her. Left Daniel with a shattered heart and 2 wine glasses that would never clink again. For days, Daniel couldn't function. He walked through the city in a daze, surrounded by strangers who didn't know his world had ended. But pain has a way of forging new paths. When the tears dried, Daniel looked at himself in the mirror, and didn't see the man Melissa had left behind. He saw something else. Something sharp. Something rising. He left his job. Took a risk on a small startup. Poured everything into it, his mind, his soul, his rage. Failure came first. Twice. 3 times. But Daniel didn't stop. He studied. He networked. He learned how to play the game Melissa had traded him for. 5 years passed. Daniel changed. The suit he now wore was tailored. The watch, Swiss. The apartment, penthouse. But his eyes remained the same. Calm. Dangerous. Silent. And then, one fall morning, his assistant placed a file on his desk. Sean Walker Industries. Acquisition opportunity, it read. Daniel smiled. It was time. Sean had no idea what was coming. His empire had cracks, small lawsuits, declining market value, overseas instability. Daniel knew just where to hit. He began slowly, acquiring minor shares, then subsidiaries. He was the quiet wind before a hurricane. By the time Sean noticed, Daniel already owned 1/3 of the company. And that's when Madeline Walker returned. Sean's estranged wife had been abroad, managing her own international affairs. She was elegant, brilliant, and utterly unforgiving. The moment she discovered Sean's affair with Melissa, and how he had used company resources to fund it, she moved like a queen on a chessboard. Within weeks, Sean's authority was revoked. Madeline, backed by Daniel, launched a full internal investigation. The media caught wind of it. Headlines screamed betrayal, scandal, collapse. The business world watched as Sean Walker was stripped of his titles, his holdings, and finally, his dignity. Melissa, who once bathed in Sean's gold, now found herself swimming in silence. The man she had chosen over Daniel was reduced to a shadow. His cards declined. His calls ignored. His name, a punchline. She called Daniel. Once. Then twice. Then 100 times. He answered only once. "I'm glad you got what you wanted, Melissa," he said. "I hope it was worth everything you lost." She sobbed. Apologized. Begged. "I didn't know who I was back then," she cried. Daniel paused. And then whispered, "Neither did I. But now I do. And you're not a part of who I am anymore." He hung up. Outside his window, Chicago shined like it always had. But this time, Daniel wasn't standing in its shadow. He was part of its skyline. And Melissa? She sat alone in a small apartment, surrounded by memories of the life she threw away. Her beauty faded in the mirror, her voice unanswered in the dark. Daniel had loved her once. But love, when sold for luxury, becomes a debt no heart should carry. And Daniel? He was done paying. The silence after Daniel hung up wasn't just a pause, it was a verdict. Melissa stared at her phone, her fingers trembling, her eyes wide with disbelief. For so long, she'd believed that Daniel would always be there. That no matter what she did, no matter how far she strayed, he would wait. But Daniel had changed. The man she once left standing in the rain was now the man standing over empires. And she? She had faded into irrelevance. Desperation turned to delusion. Melissa tried to piece back the fragments. She reached out to old friends, they had moved on. She applied for jobs, no one returned her calls. The luxurious world she had once basked in had closed its gates. She no longer belonged anywhere. And Daniel, he had never shone brighter. After reclaiming control with Madeline, Daniel didn't stop. His business model evolved. His influence stretched across industries, real estate, tech, media. His name appeared on Forbes. He was invited to every high-profile event, whispered about in powerful circles. But unlike Sean, Daniel didn't flaunt. He moved with elegance and silence, a storm wrapped in grace. Madeline, impressed by his restraint and integrity, brought him deeper into her world. Together, they restructured the Walker legacy, turning it from a corrupted shell into a symbol of revival. While rumors swirled about their closeness, Daniel kept it strictly professional, though even he couldn't deny the quiet spark that had begun to grow between them. But Daniel's heart still carried old scars. Love was no longer his weakness, it was his caution. And yet, in moments of laughter, in late-night meetings that bled into personal confessions, something unexpected bloomed between him and Madeline. Something real. Meanwhile, Sean, once a lion, was now a ghost. He lived in a rented condo far from the skyline he once ruled, nursing his ego with cheap whiskey and old headlines. His calls went unanswered. His name brought only sighs. And the woman he once used as a pawn, Melissa, was now clinging to him like wreckage in a storm. But Sean was no longer a man who could offer salvation. In Melissa, he saw everything he hated about himself: greed, vanity, and failure. "I don't need you," he spat one night, throwing her suitcase at the door. "You used me," she screamed. "And you used Daniel," he said bitterly. "That's all you know how to do. Use people." The door slammed. And with that, Melissa was homeless. Forgotten. Hollow. She wandered through the city, sleeping in temporary shelters, eating in silence, her once manicured hands shaking with shame. The woman who once lived for Chanel now begged for second-hand dignity. One rainy afternoon, she stood outside Daniel's corporate building, looking up at the glass tower that bore his initials. She was soaked, fragile, unrecognizable. And still, she hoped. She entered the lobby, but the receptionist barely glanced up. Appointment? I'm his wife, Melissa whispered. The receptionist looked her up and down. Mr. Miller doesn't take walk-ins. Please, she begged. Just tell him Melissa is here. The woman behind the desk made a call. Then another. Finally, she returned with a flat stare. Mr. Miller is in a meeting. Please, Melissa said again, voice cracking. He needs to see me. He said, and I quote, the receptionist cut her off coldly, that chapter is closed. Melissa didn't cry this time. She just nodded, turned, and walked out, slowly, like a ghost. Upstairs, Daniel stood behind a tinted window, watching. He felt nothing. Closure wasn't a word. It was a moment. And this was it. He turned away and returned to his meeting with Madeline, where a new merger was on the table. The past was buried, and the future was calling. But fate wasn't finished yet. Months later, a news story broke. A body had been found near the river. Melissa. Alive, but unconscious. Malnourished. Feverish. She had collapsed from starvation. Daniel saw the headline by accident. For a moment, he froze. The woman who once stood beside him at the altar now lay nameless in a hospital ward, hooked to machines, no one to claim her. He didn't want to go. But something inside him couldn't walk away completely. He visited, quietly, without telling anyone. There she was, pale, thin, eyes sunken but still familiar. The nurse said she had asked for him in her fevered dreams. He sat beside her for just 10 minutes. She opened her eyes and gasped softly. Daniel, she croaked. He didn't speak. I was wrong, she whispered. I lost myself. Daniel looked at her, really looked, and saw not the woman who betrayed him, but a shell. A faded memory. I don't hate you, he said gently. But I don't love you anymore either. Her tears fell. I have nothing. You had me, he replied softly. Once. But you sold that for a man who had everything, and gave you nothing. He stood up. I hope you find peace, he said. And walked away. Days passed. Melissa recovered, physically. But emotionally, she was lost. No money. No family. No love. Her punishment wasn't death, it was life. A life where she had to watch Daniel thrive, while she merely survived. Daniel never visited again. Instead, he focused on building something new, not just businesses, but legacy. He launched mentorship programs, funded shelters, created jobs for people who had once stood where he had, heartbroken, lost, unseen. And then, one quiet evening, he stood at a rooftop event beside Madeline. The skyline shimmered. The stars above Chicago blinked like applause. Do you ever regret it? Madeline asked. Regret what? Loving her. Daniel thought for a moment. No, he said. Loving her taught me what I deserve. Madeline smiled. And in that smile, Daniel saw something Melissa never gave him, respect. Not for his money. Not for his power. But for his heart. He reached for her hand. She took it. Down below, in a city full of stories, Daniel's tale had come full circle. He had lost love. He had rebuilt. He had risen. And now? Now he was finally free. Chicago was a city that remembered stories, skyscrapers whispered them to the wind, old bridges echoed them beneath the feet of strangers, and the lake itself swallowed secrets by the thousands. But Daniel's story was not just remembered. It was reborn, written in glass and steel, in legacy and silence. Months had passed since Melissa faded into the shadows of Daniel's world, and this time, she stayed there. No more desperate phone calls. No more late-night tears left on voicemail. She disappeared completely, as if she had never existed. Some said she moved to the outskirts of the city, living under a different name. Others whispered she left the country altogether. But Daniel never looked for her. She had chosen her path. And he had chosen his. Life, for Daniel, wasn't perfect, but it was whole. The man who once handed over his heart with no conditions had grown into a man who knew what love should cost, and what it should never cost again. And then came Madeline. It didn't happen all at once. She wasn't some balm to Daniel's wounds, nor a replacement. She was her own story, bold, unapologetic, and wise from her own betrayals. They had walked through fire, both of them. Lost everything to people who promised forever. And yet, here they were, building something without making promises. They built it with presence. At a winter gala in December, under crystal chandeliers and surrounded by whispers, Madeline leaned in and whispered, "This time, we write our own ending." Daniel didn't respond with words. He just held her hand, steady, sure, unchanged by storms. Meanwhile, the media took notice. Daniel Miller was no longer just a headline. He had become a symbol, of grace after grief, of power born from pain, of a man who could have sought destruction, but instead chose creation. His story was told in magazines, business schools, and podcasts. But what they didn't know, what only Daniel carried quietly, was the cost. Because revenge, even in its purest form, leaves behind ashes. There were nights Daniel would sit in the dark, remembering the version of himself that once believed love was unconditional. He mourned that boy. That boy had died the day Melissa walked away. And yet, he didn't regret it. Melissa's final chapter had unfolded without fanfare. A local journalist had tracked her down, a tiny article buried deep online. She had taken up work in a remote diner in Idaho. No makeup. No stilettos. No diamonds. Just a woman washing dishes, staring out the window at a world that no longer remembered her. When asked about Daniel, she only said, "He loved me more than I deserved. And I destroyed that. That's all I'll ever be known for." But the world didn't care. Her name was a forgotten echo. Daniel's was legend. Years passed. Daniel and Madeline continued to build, both their company and their quiet life. Eventually, they left Chicago for good, not in bitterness, but in peace. They bought a lakeside estate in upstate New York. Quiet mornings. Shared coffee. Books on Sundays. They never married. They didn't need to. Their love wasn't defined by rings or rituals. It was defined by presence. By truth. One spring evening, Daniel stood by the water as the sun dipped below the horizon. He could feel the earth breathing again, the pain of the past long softened by time. Madeline joined him, her voice soft. "You okay?" He nodded. "Just thinking." "About her?" "No," he said gently. "About him. Him. The man I used to be." Madeline leaned her head against his shoulder. "He'd be proud of you." Daniel smiled. "He'd be surprised I made it." "No," she whispered. "He always knew. He just didn't believe he deserved to rise." Daniel was silent for a long time, then looked up at the fading sun. "I didn't just survive," he said finally. "I became something no betrayal could touch." Madeline reached for his hand. And together, they stood there, quiet, strong, free. Melissa's memory faded like a shadow at dusk. Her story was a lesson. Daniel's? A legacy. Final words. In a world that sells love for luxury and loyalty for leverage, Daniel Miller rose not by stepping on others, but by refusing to stay broken. His revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was peace. It was becoming untouchable. And in the end, that was the greatest revenge of all.